When people picture Howard Hughes, they usually picture the legend first, the billionaire, the record-breaking pilot, the Hollywood producer who dated some of the most famous women on the planet. For decades, his name was shorthand for the American dream taken to its furthest extreme. More money, more fame, more daring than almost anyone else alive. But that image hides a much harder truth. The same man who once flew around the world in under 4 days spent the last years of his life locked in darkened rooms, terrified of dust, refusing to cut his hair or his nails, and surrounded by a small circle of aides who controlled almost every detail of his existence. How does a man who had everything end up with nothing but fear? That question has haunted historians, doctors, and curious strangers for nearly 50 years. Today, we're going to walk through his life from the beginning and piece together the dark reason his final years looked nothing like the myth. Howard Robard Hughes, Jr. was born in Texas in 1905, the only child of a wealthy and inventive father and a mother who was, by most accounts, anxious and overly protective. His father had made a fortune by inventing a drill bit that revolutionized oil extraction, and rather than simply selling the tool outright, he leased it to drilling companies, a decision that turned the family business into one of the most profitable private companies in America. Money was never going to be a problem for young Howard. What shaped him far more than wealth, though, was the unusual combination of his parents' personalities. His father was an engineer at heart, obsessed with tools, machines, and precision. His mother was consumed by worry, especially about illness. She is said to have checked her son for symptoms of disease almost daily, fearful of the epidemics that swept through American cities in that era, particularly polio. That combination, a boy who loved machines and a mother who feared germs, would echo throughout the rest of his life in ways nobody could have predicted. As a child, Hughes was already tinkering. He built a radio transmitter as a young teenager, rigged together a motorized bicycle from spare parts, and showed far more interest in how things worked than in traditional schoolwork. He took his first flying lesson before he was even old enough to drive, and that early fascination with aircraft would eventually define the most celebrated chapter of his life. Then, within the space of 2 years, his entire world collapsed. His mother died during medical procedure when he was a teenager, and his father followed not long after, suffering a sudden heart attack. Hughes was left without parents, without guardians telling him what to do, and with control of fortune most adults would never see in a lifetime. At 19, a court declared him an adult, free to manage his inheritance on his own terms. It is hard to overstate how strange that is. A teenager, grieving both parents, suddenly answerable to no one, holding more money and freedom than almost any young man in the country. There were no guardrails left in his life. For some people, that kind of freedom is liberating. For Howard Hughes, it removed the very structure that might have kept his later obsessions in check. Not long after his father's death, Hughes married a young Houston woman and moved to Los Angeles, determined to make his mark in the movie business. He had money, ambition, and absolutely no experience. But that didn't stop him from financing his first film almost immediately. It turned out badly enough that he had it destroyed rather than released. Most people would have walked away from filmmaking after a failure like that. Hughes doubled down instead. Over the following years, he produced a string of films that built his reputation as a serious player in the industry, including a couple that earned him real critical recognition. But it was a massive aviation war film, made at enormous cost and rebuilt more than once as Hollywood transitioned from silent pictures to sound, that revealed just how far Hughes was willing to go for control over his own creative vision. He spent staggering amounts of money on the production, demanding planes, pilots, and footage be res-hot again and again until it matched the picture in his head. It was an early glimpse of the pattern that would define the rest of his life, an inability to simply let something be finished. Later films he produced ran into trouble with censors, either for violent content or for what were considered scandalous costumes, and Hughes seemed to relish the controversy almost as much as the box office returns. His marriage did not survive this period. After 4 years, his wife returned to Houston and filed for divorce, and Hughes's personal life would never again settle into anything resembling stability. He had become a Hollywood power player, but the qualities that made him successful in business, stubbornness, obsessive attention to detail, a refusal to compromise, were already starting to strain every relationship in his life. By the late 1940s, Hughes wasn't content to simply produce films. He wanted to own a studio outright, and he got his wish when he purchased a controlling stake in a major Hollywood film company. What followed was less a triumphant takeover and more a demonstration of how destructive his need for control could be. Within weeks of taking charge, he laid off hundreds of employees. Production of new films slowed to a crawl, dropping from dozens of pictures a year to barely a handful. He halted production entirely for months at one point and ordered investigations into the political beliefs of the people still working there, wanting reassurance that the films being made matched his own views of the world. Minority shareholders accused him of mismanagement, and lawsuits piled up. Eventually, he gained almost total ownership of the studio, becoming the first single owner of a major Hollywood studio since the earliest days of the film industry, and then just months later, sold the whole thing for a tidy profit. He walked away financially successful, but the studio he left behind was a shadow of what it had been before he arrived. It was a preview of a leadership style that would repeat itself across his businesses for the rest of his life. Total control, sudden disruption, and an unwillingness to let other people make decisions, even when those decisions were good for the business. Hughes's romantic life reads almost like a list of the most celebrated actresses of his era, and that list itself became part of his legend. He was linked, at various points, to many of Hollywood's biggest stars. Some relationships were serious and long-running. Others were brief, complicated, or entirely exaggerated by the gossip pages of Time. What's clear from the people who actually worked closest to him is that his romantic pursuits often masked a deeper need for control rather than genuine partnership. One of the most telling stories involved a famous dancer and actress he pursued seriously in the late 1930s, even proposing marriage and promising to build her a home overlooking the city. At first, it looked like a fairy tale, but she came to feel that Hughes was trying to manage every part of her life, monitor her phone calls, controlling how often she could see her own mother, behaving as though she were property rather than a partner. When she finally ended things and returned his gifts, those who knew him said it was one of the only times anyone ever witnessed him show open emotional vulnerability. It's a strange detail, because so much of his public persona was built on appearing unshakable. There were other women who saw through the charm entirely. One actress, after resisting his advances for years, was famously quoted suggesting that Hughes seemed incapable of loving anything that didn't have an engine in it. And yet, that same man quietly paid for years of specialized medical care for her disabled daughter, without ever making it public. That contradiction, coldness paired with sudden, private generosity, shows up again and again in the people who knew him. He could be controlling to the point of cruelty, and yet capable of real loyalty when someone he cared about actually needed him. Perhaps the most enduring relationship of his life was with an actress he first met in the 1940s and eventually married many years later. Unlike so many of his other romances, she remained connected to him for decades, even as he became more reclusive, and their marriage existed mostly on paper. When the marriage eventually ended, she reportedly accepted a modest settlement and refused to pursue any claim on his enormous estate, telling people simply that she understood exactly who the real star of that relationship had always been. If Hollywood gave Hughes fame, aviation gave him purpose. He founded his own aircraft company in the early 1930s and threw himself into engineering and flying with an intensity that went far beyond hobby. He personally piloted experimental aircraft to break world speed records, set transcontinental flight time records, and eventually piloted a flight around the entire globe in under 4 days, an achievement that earned him a ticker-tape parade to the streets of New York and a stack of the aviation world's most prestigious awards. He also became obsessed with building the largest aircraft ever constructed, an enormous flying boat made primarily of wood due to wartime material shortages. Critics mocked the project mercilessly for years, as it ran wildly over budget and behind schedule, and Hughes was eventually called before a Senate committee to explain himself. He flew the massive aircraft personally for its only flight, lasting barely a minute and reaching only a few dozen feet off the water, but for Hughes, simply proving it could leave the ground at all was enough vindication. What rarely gets discussed alongside these triumphant headlines is the physical cost. Hughes survived several aviation accidents over the years, but 2 in particular left permanent damage. The first happened while he was testing an amphibious aircraft, a crash that killed 2 of the men aboard and left Hughes with a serious head injury. The far more devastating crash came a few years later, during a test flight on an experimental military aircraft. A mechanical failure sent the plane spiraling out of control, and rather than attempting an emergency landing in open space, Hughes tried to reach a nearby golf course. He didn't make it. The aircraft slammed into a residential neighborhood, destroying several homes and bursting into flames. He was pulled from the wreckage barely alive, his chest crushed, his ribs broken, one lung collapsed, his heart literally pushed out of position inside his chest, and his body covered in severe burns. Doctors at the time considered his recovery nearly miraculous. But surviving an injury and fully healing from it are two very different things. The chronic pain from that crash never fully went away, and the methods used to manage it in that era, heavy reliance on painkillers, including opiates, would go on to shape the rest of his life in ways far darker than anyone realized at the time. Hughes's ambitions never stayed confined to one industry. In the late 1930s, he began quietly buying stock in a major American airline, eventually gaining effective control without ever holding an official title. He personally financed one of the largest aircraft orders in history to modernize the airline's fleet, and his political connections helped the company secure international routes that few competitors could match. But as the industry shifted toward jet aircraft, Hughes struggled to make decisions, delayed critical payments, and clashed constantly with the executives trying to manage his own company. Eventually, banks forced him out of any management role, and years later, lawsuits forced him to sell his shares entirely in a deal that, despite everything, still made him hundreds of millions of dollars. He poured money into real estate, aircraft manufacturing, and eventually into an entire city. In the mid-1960s, Hughes arrived in Las Vegas and quietly began buying up hotels and casinos, eventually owning a significant portion of the city's most famous properties. He wanted to reshape Las Vegas's image, moving it away from its rougher, mob-associated reputation towards something more polished and respectable. In his own words, captured in internal memos, he wanted the city to feel like elegant guests stepping out in an expensive car rather than the rough gambling town it had been known as. But the same man reshaping a city's image from the top floor of a hotel was, on the floor just below, disappearing from the world entirely. When he eventually left one of his long-term hotel residences, staff discovered that the curtains in his room had never been opened during his entire stay. They had rotted from being permanently shut. A small, tightly controlled group of personal aides, many of them members of the same religious community, managed nearly every aspect of his daily life, his businesses, and his contact with the outside world. They handled correspondence, ran errands, and fulfilled requests that ranged from ordinary to bizarre, including one well-documented episode where Hughes requested an enormous specialty order of a discontinued ice cream flavor, only to lose interest in it almost immediately after arrived. It's a strange, almost comic detail, but it captures something sad underneath the surface. A man with nearly unlimited resources, surrounded by people whose entire job was to anticipate his needs, and still fundamentally isolated from any normal human connection. To understand how Hughes ended up the way he did, you have to look past the business deals and the headlines into the psychological pattern that had likely been forming since childhood. After his death, a noted psychologist conducted an extensive review of his life, interviewing former staff and studying years of personal letters, phone transcripts, and records. The conclusion was that Hughes's fear of illness and contamination almost certainly had roots in his childhood, shaped by a mother who had been intensely anxious about disease and infection. That early environment, combined with personality already inclined toward obsessive focus and a need for total control, created fertile ground for what would later become a severe and worsening pattern of compulsive behavior. As an adult, that fear expressed itself in increasingly extreme rituals. He wrote out detailed, multi-step instructions for staff on tasks as mundane as opening a can of food, insisting that labels be removed, surfaces scrubbed completely clean, and that no part can ever touch anything he might eat from. He demanded repeated hand-washing from anyone near his food and insisted on extensive precautions to avoid any contact with germs he believed might be lurking on ordinary objects. And yet, in one of the strangest contradictions of his life, his own personal hygiene deteriorated badly during these same years. Psychologists who studied his case later suggested that, in his mind, the danger was always external, something coming from outside that needed to be kept at bay, never something that could originate from himself. In the later stages of his life, he developed a habit of using tissues to pick up everyday objects rather than touching them with his bare hands, and he became fixated on tiny imperfections most people would never even notice, whether a flaw in someone's clothing or a smudge nobody else could see. At one point, he retreated into a dark screening room and stayed there for months at a time, eating very little beyond chocolate bars and chicken, watching films on repeat, surrounded by stacked boxes of tissues, instructing his aides not to speak to him unless he spoke first. When he finally emerged, he had not bathed, cut his hair, or trimmed his nails in weeks. From the mid-1960s until his death roughly a decade later, Hughes essentially vanished from public life. He moved between hotel suites in several cities and countries, rarely seen, his presence confirmed mostly through second-hand accounts from the handful of aides allowed near him. He reportedly spent extraordinary sums simply maintaining his private accommodations, at one point allegedly spending millions in a single year at one hotel alone. He became fixated on certain films, watching at least one of them well over 100 times according to those who worked for him, and he bought up every copy he could find of another film he had personally produced decades earlier, reportedly out of guilt after learning that several cast and crew members had later developed cancer following filming near a nuclear testing site. His isolation became so complete that, in the early 1970s, a writer was able to convince publishers and the public that he had personally collaborated on Hughes's authorized autobiography, despite never having actually met him. The hoax only collapsed when Hughes broke years of public silence to deny it directly during a telephone conference with journalists who could confirm his voice. That an elaborate literary fraud, to get as far as it did, says everything about how completely Hughes had disappeared from the world he once dominated. People simply had no real frame of reference left for what was true and what wasn't, because the man himself had become almost a rumor. Howard Hughes died in 1976 while being transported by aircraft from Mexico back to a hospital in Houston. He was 70 years old, and the official cause of death was kidney failure. But it was the condition of his body that genuinely stunned the people who saw him. The handsome aviator the world remembered was gone. In his place was a frail, severely malnourished man whose hair and nails had grown long and untrimmed, whose body bore the marks of bed sores, and whose arms showed evidence of broken hypodermic needle fragments left under the skin from years of injected pain medication. His features had changed so drastically that authorities reportedly needed fingerprints to formally confirm his identity. Even in death, the strangeness didn't end. Weeks later, a handwritten document surfaced claiming to be his will, distributing his fortune among charities, employees, distant relatives, and even a stranger who claimed he had once given a disheveled hitchhiker a ride. A court eventually ruled the document a forgery, and because Hughes had left no valuable behind, his estate, worth billions, was eventually divided among more than 20 distant cousins he likely never spent meaningful time with.